The militia have captured Stag's airship and set up a watchtower with sentry guns. Looks like it's controlled from that central command point. I need to take it out. That soldier is equipped with a device that can track my detective mode systems. If I use it for too long, he'll be able to pinpoint my location and alert the others.
Good evening, good morning, whatever time of day it is for you. Welcome to this thing that I do called Thor's Entertainment, and I am Thor. Today we are continuing our journey through the militia-related missions in Batman Arkham Knight. And we are completing the 4 militia missions with one goal in mind. We want to face off against the world's greatest assassin, Slade Wilson, otherwise known as Deathstroke. You have probably already noticed, but we're going to go ahead and skip the setup and just do the intro while I'm doing the first portion of this side mission in the background. We have already done this portion of the side mission because it was a requirement while we played through the City of Fear storyline. We have already completed one of the militia side missions, and that one was Own the Roads. In that side mission, we were introduced to Deathstroke returning to Gotham, and he is there because he is the new militia commander. He ended up taking up that position after the the Arkham Knight fled, and after we eventually defeated Scarecrow. Now, even though the people who hired him are no longer in the picture, Deathstroke has already taken the money, and he is going to see this mission through to the very end. He intends to kill Batman regardless if his employers are around or not. So what that means is, with the Arkham Knight and Scarecrow no longer in the picture, all we need to do is take down Deathstroke, and then all of a sudden we have technically beaten the militia. So the whole point of the previous episode, the Own the Roads mission, was to take out all the roadblocks that are located all around Gotham. In this episode, Occupy Gotham, we are looking to take away their aerial advantage. Right now they have radars pointed at the sky to take us down if we happen to glide by. So what we're going to do for Occupy Gotham is we're going to locate the rooftops where those radars are, and we are going to destroy them and allow ourselves to be able to fly around freely in Gotham again. So like I mentioned earlier, we have already completed this portion of the side mission due to having already played through the main City of Fear storyline. So no matter what you do, as long as you play the main story, you will have completed at least one milestone for Occupy Gotham. And since you have already seen this, I can very confidently say you probably don't care about what's going on in the background too much, and I have no problem talking over everything going on. Of course, if you want to see it, it's still available to you to take a look at. After all, you may not necessarily just want to hear my wonderful voice the entire time. So yeah, having already completed the Own the Road side mission, that just leaves us with 3 militia side missions to go. So let's go ahead and get Occupy Gotham knocked out as well, and just have ourselves 2 remaining militia missions and get that much closer to fighting Deathstroke.
There's militia on the roof of Sionis Industries. I'll tear this occupation apart, one watchtower at a time.
The men are armed and well trained, sir, but they scare like all the others.
One of my favorite Deathstroke-related storylines comes from the early days of New 52. The name of that comic run was called Legacy, and if you are not familiar with who Slade Wilson is, go ahead and pick it up. It's a great way of getting introduced to the character overall. It'll give you a great idea of his strengths, weaknesses, insecurities, infamy, and his overall motivations. All the stuff that makes a character interesting. I do think it's worth pointing out that compared to a lot of other comic book characters like your Supermans and the Flashes and the Green Lanterns, Deathstroke is kind of old. His age range tends to be around 45 or older. That means all the things he is mostly known for, like his military career and becoming the world's greatest assassin, well, all that mostly occurred before the big rise of superhumans. Now, don't get me wrong, superhumans definitely existed at the time, but the big names, like the ones I rattled off earlier, the Supermen, the Green Lanterns, the Flashes, well, they weren't really around during that time. And they would end up showing up after Deathstroke was already a very notorious mercenary. I point that out because the Legacy storyline kind of focuses on that a little bit, and throws it out to the reader that Deathstroke is kind of adapting to a new world.
You're a hunter, Batman, a guerrilla. You're good, but this is a different kind of war.
Where all of his qualities as an assassin may have been much more valuable before compared to how they are now. So the big early theme in Legacy is that in a world with superhumans, and where superhuman groups like the Justice League are rising, and there are quite a few of them around now, people begin to think that maybe Deathstroke can't keep up. Like he's gotten old, and the amount of qualities that he had before that made him really useful, well, they don't really matter in a world where people can, fly into space or shoot lasers out of their eyes. Or, possibly just rip out someone's spine Mortal Kombat fatality style if they really wanted to. So yeah, the public perception is that Deathstroke probably cannot keep up with these new, very powerful superhumans or metahumans or whatever you want to call them. And this perception is only really exacerbated by the fact that yes, he is in fact getting older. And perhaps if he was still in his prime, people wouldn't be so skeptical about it, but that's just not the case. So there's going to be plenty of scrutiny and a lot of doubts.
You always hold back, Batman. Very soon, that will cost you. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm getting kind of tired of all this rioting.
The drone sensors are temporarily disabled, but I can only hack one at a time. The previous drone will be back online.
That's not supposed to happen. What is it?
There's a watchtower stationed opposite GCPD. I'm taking it down.
So as I was saying, Deathstroke was getting really tired of being undervalued and, just having a bunch of scrutiny because of little factors like one's age. But he was getting older and possibly an outdated commodity, at least in the eyes of the public. So in these line of comics, Deathstroke is just getting tired of public opinion. He hated that the perception was ultimately tainting his legacy and reputation. The breaking point was when his contract manager arranged a contract for him that required him to work with a younger, up-and-coming mercenary team. Now that mercenary team, its name changes quite a bit throughout that brief period of time that they're in the comic. It starts off as the Alpha Dogs, then I think it's like Harmony or Harmory, and then it's just Harm Armory. I believe the constant changing of the name for the brief time that they're around is to indicate that yes, they are up and coming, and they are so new, in fact, they haven't really committed to what they wanted to be called and how they wanted to be known. So ultimately, Slade, he considered this to be an insulting gesture because he thought it was a job that he could easily just do on his own. And he certainly didn't consider it the kind of difficult job that would require him to have to team up with younger assassins to accomplish. So you could say he probably saw it as a situation where he wasn't really being hired to do a job, he's being hired to train his replacements. And considering this was arranged by one of the most trusted people he knows, his contract manager, suddenly he was in a situation where even the people he was closest to were beginning to doubt him. Even though he doesn't like it, he does agree to the contract and he completes the job. The surprising part is at the very end, after the job is done, Deathstroke goes ahead and kills the new mercenary group. He acknowledged that they were pretty good, but he doesn't need them to be around. He does not compliment them by saying that they're up and coming and had a bunch of, potential. Instead, he just considers them competition, and that's something he was not willing to have.
It's been a long time since I was in a war zone, Bat. I feel young again.
This was the first of many statement kills where Deathstroke said, I'm not just going to be replaced, I'm not just going to be forgotten. I'm going to be remembered as one of the best. Not just one of the best, in fact. I'm going to be the world's greatest assassin till the day I die. Stepping down was never going to be in the cards.
The militia have a watchtower overlooking Chinatown. I need to make an example and crush them.
Scans reveal these men are armed, sir. Crush them with a degree of caution.
So we have established that Deathstroke killed the rival mercenary group because he considered them competition, and competition is not something he feels he needs. Slade Wilson then goes over to his contract manager and emphasizes that message he just made. I do not want any more team-up jobs. I do not want any more easy jobs. Give me the most difficult. Give me the impossible. If he accomplishes these, then there would be no more doubters. They would all be silenced. He was ready to show the world what he can still do and how good he still is. He described it as he is going to kick in the door of every single target that he goes after, because that is what he has always done, it's what he can still do, and that's what he always will do. Now he was saying that to say that he has not lost a step and that he is still as good as he ever was. And so yeah, he went out to solidify his legacy and protect it from any sort of scrutiny that it was previously under. Or at least that was the plan. After he was done with his contract manager, he then went on to kill the person that put out the contract to begin with because it was just riddled with false information that ultimately just continued to damage the reputation that he had. Now, the person that put out that contract was protected by his own mercenaries and metahumans, but that did not matter. Deathstroke ended up taking them down, took down some sort of a squad of motorcycle pursuers, and even took down an armed plane. And yes, in the end, he did kill the person that put out that contract. So yeah, with all that carnage, it definitely got a lot of media attention, and allowed Slade Wilson to say to the world, yes, I am still a top-tier assassin. And it also allowed him to air a personal challenge to any other mercenary that feels differently. If they think they are the best, better than the world's greatest, then they'll have to take him out. And so yeah, plenty of assassins then tried to kill Deathstroke. And pretty much all of them are killed for trying. There's only one assassin that actually is successful against Slade, and they don't kill him, they just defeat him. Now that person ends up being his own son, Grant Wilson, former Ravager.
We can do for him. We spread out. Get revenge. Divide and conquer, right, Batman? You know the art of war. Double up. Cover each other's backs now.
Now, Ravager is just a title that Grant Wilson held within the DC universe, kind of like the title of Batman or Deathstroke or Superman. It's just a name. It's a title he ends up losing to his sister Rose Wilson on occasion. I guess DC just decides which one of them is more popular and then gives them the title, and it bounces back and forth. Then there is also a point in the comic where Deathstroke goes out of his way to talk about the Greek hero Achilles. Now, he kind of idolizes Achilles as a warrior who managed to transcend time and become such a mythological figure that he's universally recognized as a warrior that it was one of the greatest of all time.
Do not drop your guard. Do not lower your guns. Do not let him strike.
Even well beyond his death, people remember Achilles. Now, Deathstroke, he kind of uses the myth of Achilles as a motivator as well as a cautionary tale. From a motivator perspective, he kind of implies that he wants to become such a notorious assassin in the world of contract killers that he gets regarded in the same way. He wants to be remembered as a warrior of myth, one whose deeds are so great that they transcend time as well, and his legacy then lives on well beyond his death. He wants his deeds to last forever. What motivates Deathstroke is having a legacy and a reputation that lasts well beyond his lifetime, just like, Achilles. But unlike someone like Achilles, who is fighting for, a country in the Trojan War, Deathstroke just fights for money. Doing that, he utilizes the amount of money that he has paid as a representation of how the world values him and respects him. Now, Slade already has made a pretty big fortune, so he doesn't really care about the money. He doesn't need it. He just wants to be the top paid assassin because that would mean that the world views him as the best. So he takes anything that would damage his reputation as a pretty big offense, and that's why in this game series specifically, he views Batman as someone who has offended him quite a bit.
It's been too long since I had a real fight.
So yeah, overall, Deathstroke's rampage through the Legacy storyline is, pretty successful. Even so, he does end up struggling quite a bit at times. And you begin to see some of the weaknesses that come with having been in this job for so long and getting a little bit older. Little things like his reflexes have slowed down, his healing factor, while still good, isn't quite as quick as it used to be, and he even begins to shake in his hands with tremors every time he starts to fight. Overall, he's just not quite as sharp as he used to be, despite still being quite deadly. All of this stuff does add up though, and in the end he is bested by his own son, Grant. Now, Grant doesn't kill his father, he just leaves him defeated. And even though he ends up surviving, this does show Deathstroke that there are others on the rise, and that eventually he is probably going to end up being defeated permanently or replaced, despite how much he's trying to avoid that. So even if he is eventually going to die fighting, you have to wonder, how is he going to go out?
Not bad, Batman. But don't forget, I do this for a living. When are we gonna get some action?
A watchtower has been set up on an abandoned building overlooking Perdition Bridge. It won't keep me pinned down. This is my city.
It is at this point I realize I really just glossed over the fact that Grant Wilson defeated Slade Wilson. and I have offered no explanation as to how that happened or why they were even facing off against each other. So allow me a moment to fix that. So Slade is kind of a crappy father. Like, 3 for 3. He has 3 kids and he has sucked with every single one of them. In Grant's case, he saw Grant as the natural successor to his legacy. He was preparing him to be the next greatest assassin, and that's pretty much what he did his entire life. So, Grant inevitably was traumatized by constant abuse and being trained up to be just like Slade, regardless of whether or not he wanted to. And I will say it's unclear whether or not Grant actually wanted to be assassin or if he was just doing it to get his father's approval. Regardless of the reason, though, he does step up to Slade's challenge and does try to be the next best assassin. And that's how he ultimately becomes the character Ravager.
You know what the difference is between us, Batman? You're a trained fighter. I'm a trained killer.
The militia have established a watchtower on the City Vision building. Time to remind them the high ground's taken.
I should warn you, sir, they appear to be heavily armed.
To try living up to Slade Wilson's expectations, his son Grant Wilson ends up going through rigorous training performed by his father. The expectations are very high, and even whenever Grant succeeds, oftentimes it is criticized as still not being enough or not being perfect. Regardless of all of the criticism and lessons that seem to be at the expense of Grant, he continues on with the training and eventually does perform to the standard that Slade Wilson had in mind. Or at least so he says. Because eventually he does give Grant his blessing in going out and being an assassin who was trained by him. He ends up giving him his own gear and weapons to use in the field, and the costume itself is very similar to the Deathstroke one. It's just more of a gray pattern and has both eyes, since, Grant has that luxury of having both. The coloration's much more gray, and this is the costume that he receives whenever he takes on the Ravager moniker. So now we have to ask, how did the heir to the Deathstroke throne go ahead and do as an assassin? Unfortunately, it does not go as well for Grant as it did for his father. In the end, Grant ends up dying as an assassin with the Ravager name, and Deathstroke kind of has to mourn the loss of his son, because even though he was kind of a complete dick and trained him to be a weapon his entire life, in some screwed up way he did care about his son, and the loss of him didn't exactly leave him without any form of sadness. But there is a good cliche for movies and video games that if you do not find a body or see them die, they are probably not actually dead. And sure enough, they never did find Grant Wilson's body. Then again, this is DC Comics we're talking about, so they never really needed a body for them to, come back to life. I mean, this is the game that has Jason Todd as the antagonist. And in the game universe, they actually never find the Jason Todd body either. In the comics, it's definitely a lot different in the fact that they do have the body and still he comes back from the dead. So yeah, gee whiz. Anyone can come back from the dead in DC Comics, or just, I guess, comics in general, but I'm poking fun at DC specifically, so we're just going to go ahead and keep throwing them out there. Alright, I think I'm done ranting a little bit, and that rant specifically was just to point out that no body was ever found whenever they were looking for the remains of Grant Wilson. And with no body found, the reader is pretty safe in assuming that Grant Wilson is not actually dead. And if the reader did assume that, they were correct, because Grant Wilson was certainly not dead.
I respect you, Batman. It's been too long since I killed a man worthy of that.
It turns out that Grant did survive and has been out on his own for quite some time, and after all the years of training that you could probably call abuse, Grant has decided that he is not really looking to be the successor to his father anymore. He just wants to be superior to his father. He wants to prove that he is better. So to do that, probably the easiest and most effective way of doing it would be to go ahead and kill his father. But if he learned anything from his dad, he learned to never do a job for free. So, he was hired to do it. But by who? Well, let's rewind back to that young mercenary team that Deathstroke took out. Turned out a member of that team had some pretty wealthy parents. and those wealthy parents were none too thrilled to find out that their child had been offed by Deathstroke. So what they did was hire a bunch of assassins to try and kill him, and they were hiring them one at a time to wear some very thematically appropriate gear based around their child, and then go out and try to kill him.
I'm not the Arkham Knight. This isn't personal, and I do not retreat after a setback. I will end this, Bat, before the break of dawn.
Now, why they didn't just hire multiple assassins to go out and try and kill him instead of one at a time, I don't know. Especially when the one at a time method, led to a bunch of dead assassins. I don't know, I guess being wealthy doesn't guarantee that you know math. Anyway, after several of the assassins that were hired by the wealthy family were killed off, Grant Wilson steps in and says that he will do the job, and they hire him. So finally, Grant is being paid some pretty big money to go out and take down his old man.
You think you can beat these men? They've got a real commander now.
He's going to get that opportunity to prove that he is the better assassin and just superior to Deathstroke. Not an heir, just a better. The battle between Grant and his father is actually very close. It could have gone either way. So in a way, I guess Deathstroke did end up getting the son that he wanted, or at least the assassin that he wanted. Just rather than someone who was motivated by, continuing the legacy, he was much more motivated by destroying it.
You fight like an old man. Where's the fury gone?
Before we got the opportunity to see who was going to win in this fight, it is ultimately interrupted by the employer. You see, whenever Grant took this contract, he kind of withheld the information that he was in fact related to Deathstroke. And keep in mind, the wealthy family only ever put a contract out on Deathstroke because he killed their child. So now, they suddenly find themselves in the possession of Deathstroke's child. So I guess you could say they got a little bit vindictive, and rather than just letting Grant finish the job, they said, fuck that, we're just going to go ahead and torture the crap out of you and try to make Slade feel bad. And while they're pulling off this Dr. Evil crap, of course Slade and Grant ended up getting the upper hand, and well, that wealthy family is suddenly very dead. In the end, Grant does have the opportunity to kill Deathstroke, but rather than going through with it, he decides to just leave his father and go off on a separate path. Now that's a pretty good setup, and it made it seem like Grant Wilson was going to get a really strong push as Ravager in the New 52. Unfortunately, and I don't really know this for a fact, but I didn't really see Ravager, at least not the Grant Wilson Ravager, in anything else after that. So I feel like DC kind of just abandoned that plot line, and unfortunately as a result of that, I don't know how that ended, or if it ever actually ended. The only other Wilson kids I ended up seeing in New 52 are Rose Wilson and Jericho Wilson. But we'll get to those two a little bit later.
Keep fighting, Batman. Hit the militia as hard as you can. I'll be waiting to finish you off.
We'll break the bat. I know it. We've got the numbers.
Well-armed militia have fortified the roof of the Goth Corp building. I need to plan my attack.
The battle with Grant had some pretty long-lasting effects for Deathstroke. I mean, the Wilson family was pretty much already destroyed, but now it has a lot more of a broken family feel than it ever has before, since Grant's alive and now trying to kill his father. But besides just that, Deathstroke still has the existential issue of what is his place in the world as an assassin when the world around him is changing drastically to include superhumans. On one hand, throughout the events of Legacy, he was able to keep up with multiple superhumans. On the other, Grant was able to basically beat him in that fight, and it revealed quite a bit about himself and what weaknesses he has. I spoke on it a little bit earlier, but Deathstroke idolizes Achilles. And I spoke to how he wants to be a mythological character that can be spoken about in the same kind of essence as Achilles. I also mentioned that that's a little bit of a cautionary tale, but I didn't really elaborate on that. So, why don't we go ahead and do it now? The big thing with Achilles, and something he even points out, is that it's a cautionary tale about one's weaknesses, and how if you're not aware of them and don't do anything to compensate for them, ultimately it's going to be your undoing. And that's exactly what happens with Deathstroke here. He can still keep up with the best of them, and he certainly is deserving of the world's greatest assassin title until someone takes it from him, quite possibly by taking his life. But he is not unbeatable. In fact, he's more beatable now than he probably has been for most of his life.
You were angry when we first met, Batman. Young, full of rage. You think you've still got that fight?
I wish my old sergeant could see me now. I'd dishonorably discharge a whole damn clip in his face.
I'm going after the militia positioned outside Port Adams. These towers are their eyes. I'll blind them.
During the battle with Grant, his reflexes were slower than they've been since basically before he had superpowers. His healing is also not doing as great as it once was, and he even starts to develop little things like tremors in his hands to where they're shaking whenever he tries to fight. It all starts to add up after a while, and suddenly Deathstroke starts to seem a little bit more beatable. And Mr. Slade Wilson is not going to pretend like he doesn't notice that, and that's not there. In fact, he's quite aware of it. The legendary Deathstroke suddenly has a great deal of weaknesses, and eventually he's going to have too many to compensate for. So respecting a cautionary tale won't be enough to keep him alive forever.
You're a one-man army, Batman. But you know what we are? A real army.
Souvenir. Thing damn near electrocuted me when I picked it up.
I'm taking on the watchtower overlooking Penitence Bridge.
Very good, sir. Those fortifications are a blight on our skyline.
That being said, the discussion then starts to sway away from proving to the world that you're the world's greatest assassin, and starts to go into more of a conversation about how is his time as the world's greatest assassin going to end. It becomes clear at the end of that battle, more clear than it's ever been, that the end is quite possibly near for that title and for Deathstroke as a whole. And it's hard not to be curious about how he's going to go out. Because you know he's not just going to retire. He's going to instead try to go out in a blaze of glory. He is likely to do something that, regardless of whether or not he is successful or if he fails, is going to be so big and so universally recognizable that he will be remembered forever. It'll be the perfect conclusion, a bookend to a lifelong career of being the world's greatest assassin.
I fought a lot of guys like you, Batman. A lot of wannabe heroes. You're the best, but you'll die like the others.
Reports placed Quinzel in the northern sector of Bleak Island. They say she came back for the bat.
The watchtower is in operation around the docks on the east coast of Founders Island.
Send them by way of the others, Master Bruce.
Target lost! I say again, we have lost eyes on target!
So, the Deathstroke storyline legacy ends with us wondering how exactly his legacy is going to end. And that's exactly what we go on to question in the next storyline, where Slade seems to be preparing for the end of his story. And he is offered a truly impossible target to take down. Once the offer is made to him, he takes it up with the mentality that he would kill the impossible target or die gloriously. He wants the battle to be remarkable and fitting for a warrior like him, even if it's his last. The impossible target he is hired to kill, or capture actually, is Lobo. They would have been okay with either a kill or a capture, but let's be honest, it's Deathstroke, so yeah, he's going to try and kill Lobo. And in case you do not know, Lobo is an intergalactic bounty hunter. He's part of a alien species that he killed every single member of. So yeah, he's actually the last of his kind, and I think he destroyed his home planet, or he may have just left it without his people on it anymore. I can't remember. Anyway, genocide.
Last time you held back, Batman. You pulled those last few punches when you should have left scars.
Have you seen this gun? How'd they pay for this gear?
And he wasn't just satisfied with his own planet, he went on to destroy other planets as well. He went on to get a pretty iconic motorcycle, and he refers to it as the Space Hog. And Lobo went on to have a bunch of random adventures like meeting a bunch of space dolphins. And yes, that is a real thing. Lobo is kind of a weird character. He's typically a villain, but it's more of a, we'll call it a comedy villain. Like, he's super powerful, but he's never going to be made out to be like this world-ending threat, at least not typically, like a Lex Luthor or a Brainiac or something like that, even though he really could be. But yeah, eventually once he did find his way to Earth, he went back and forth between being good, neutral, and just full-on villain. There was an occasion when he tried killing Superman, and he did come very, very close, but he came up a little bit short on that one. With that being said, though, he is a planet-destroying threat who can reasonably fight against the Man of Steel and nearly win. He is also immortal, and he's able to regenerate from essentially any wound as long as any part of his body still remains. As I am saying this, that does sound kind of impossible to kill as a target, and I can understand why Deathstroke would want this as his swan song to end his career. As far as I'm aware, he has never taken down a superhuman at that level, and most assassins with minimal or no powers probably could not pull that off.
Who trained you, Bat? You're good.
The militia have a watchtower stationed on top of an abandoned building in Otisburg. I'll take them out.
So yeah, this would potentially be Slade going out in a blaze of glory after losing most of his family. And it really wouldn't matter if he died because he didn't really have a whole lot more to prove as an assassin at this point. So how did Slade Wilson fare in the fight against Lobo? You know, the world's greatest assassin versus the intergalactic bounty hunter. And how did that fight even come to happen to begin with? Well, Lobo took a break from the bounty hunting thing to become he was dealing in extraterrestrial slaves. So yeah, the ship he was piloting full of the people from many different planets crashed onto Earth, and eventually Lobo was captured. There was a secret extraterrestrial-focused government agency that held him successfully for a pretty long time, but he eventually escaped. Now, Lobo intends to destroy the Earth for holding him captive, and then he's just going to go ahead and return to his nefarious ways in space. It is this shadowy agency that reaches out to Deathstroke in a unconventional prove your worth by not having us kill you kind of way, and Deathstroke ends up besting the people they throw at him, and then they offer him the contract. Now, they go to Deathstroke specifically because the incredibly public options like the Justice League would certainly handle this threat, but they're a discreet and seedy agency. They don't want to be known, so they can't really go with the public option. That's why they went with the discreet and deadly option like Deathstroke. So now he gets a crack at stopping this potentially world-ending threat.
You left me rotting in a jail cell, Bat. I'll do worse to you.
Time to take out the watchtower on the Memorial Hospital roof.
It's a shame the facility isn't in action, sir. You'd be saving them a trip.
Deathstroke ends up tracking down Lobo, and the two do face off in a pretty one-sided fight for a while. Lobo is way ahead of Deathstroke in almost every combative statistic you can think of. He is in the same power class as Superman, after all. The one area where Slade had an advantage is being a tactician, and he was able to somewhat outthink the mostly brute force approach of Lobo. Despite being bested for most of their fights, Slade eventually manages to impale Lobo on his own space hog before blowing up the motorcycle and Lobo with some thermal detonators. Now, this ending implied that the explosion was enough to destroy Lobo's entire body and kill him. But guess what? And stop me if you've heard this one before. No body was ever found or recovered for Lobo. So, Lobo was most likely... Yeah, you guessed it. Lobo was alive. At least in the long run. But we'll get to that in a second. This gave Deathstroke the win against the most powerful character he has ever taken down. And in New 52, this opened the door for Slade being a credible threat to powerful superhumans. And we're talking about characters that prior to this moment would have been considered outclassing him. We would begin to see him going against much more high-profile characters from that point forward, and that became a really common theme later on in New 52. Despite the win, Lobo's death would not become permanent. This comic does not imply that any part of him survived the explosion, at least to the point where he could regenerate, but DC has never been the type to let a character that big named be killed off so early on in one of their reboots. And that certainly wasn't going to be the case in New 52 either. So even though he comes back eventually, this is still a win for Slade, and Lobo would regenerate and somehow return down the line. I forget the specifics, but after the Lobo Hunt storyline for Deathstroke, there really wasn't a whole lot of major development. You got to see Deathstroke going against an incredibly large number of ninjas, like hundreds of them, before they end up being defeated, and he ends up taking down their leader, who was hiring him to kill somebody under false pretenses, in which case the person that he was hired to kill then hires him to kill his original contract holder, or something to that extent. It's not bad, but it's just not quite as, we'll say, memorable after you have killed somebody like Lobo. And after that, there weren't too many other major things to talk about. And I believe that's about where his first solo run came to an end. It would be a few years before we got a solo run for Deathstroke again, and it felt like it kind of ended unceremoniously the first time around. You had a bunch of plot points that just didn't really go anywhere. Like, for instance, I already talked about this quite a bit, but it felt like they were trying to build Grant Wilson up for a bigger role down the road in the Deathstroke solo run, and it just never happens. And to my knowledge, it never happened in anything else. I don't know. I really enjoyed the writing in that line of comics, but it just came to such a sudden end that I just really wanted a proper ending.
Studying your skills, your victories, and your defeats. I'm ready.
You get to meet him? Oh, the Knight? I've seen him, but... No, the advisor. Guy the Knight brought in, the assassin. Him? No, I just do what the voice on the radio says. Guy's a badass, man, seriously. I am? Sure did. I was limping for a week. It's odd, though. What? I saw him take a couple decent beatings, right? But he's always up and fighting the next day. Guy heals fast.
The militia's gone for the high ground, overlooking Salvation Bridge.
They think they're safe in their watchtowers. They're in for quite a shock.
Actually, I did forget about one storyline that comic run actually did pretty well, and it's mention-worthy. After the Lobo Hunt portion of that comic run, it goes into the backstory of Slade Wilson, back when he was just Slade Wilson. It shows him in the military and how he eventually rose into a special forces team before he was ever selected for any sort of a super soldier related experiment.
The Knight really hated you, Batman. That's why he failed. These things should never be personal.
The militia are holed up at the Botanical Garden Station. I'm taking them down.
Every watchtower you destroy is a blow to militia morale, sir. But be warned, the soldiers here are armed.
Back in those days, he was reporting directly to his CO, and that's who he would eventually go on to marry, so I think that it's kind of cool to see how they began to get to know each other and what would eventually be their relationship before it all went to absolute crap. Plus, it doesn't really get talked about a whole lot, but Adeline, the wife of Slade Wilson, is also a pretty big badass in her own right. It's kind of hard to get some comic panel time versus the world's greatest assassin, but she's definitely mention-worthy and definitely worth looking into. So, yeah. The very first solo comic run for Deathstroke during the New 52, it was pretty good at first. And then it kind of came to a very sudden and unceremonious end. It did a lot of things well, and despite it ending really quickly, I look back on it fondly. One thing it does capture very well is the mentality of Slade Wilson, and it also gives you a really good understanding of what things were like with his family. You get to see what the long-term ramifications were for his son Grant. You get to see the beginning stages of his relationship with Adeline before it eventually turned into, well, what it eventually turned into later on their marriage and prior to her death. So going back to my original statement, if you want to get to know the character of Slade Wilson, to check out those run of comics, having revisited them myself just to do this little dialogue, yeah, I'd say that's still true. It holds up, and I would recommend it.
This has been a long time coming. I've honed my skills, sharpened my senses. Have you?
No money, no more jobs, and no way out of this freaking city so long as that assassin's still.
The Royal Flush Gang's rooftop in Kingston has been taken over. The militia. I'll take it back.
Oh man. I guess that wraps up all of the original solo run stuff for Deathstroke during New 52. And I don't really want to get into the second solo run for him at the end of New 52, at least not yet. But we still have like 15 minutes left on this video, so I have no idea what I'm going to talk about now. I'll eventually get to Jericho and Rose, but that's a conversation that also kind of warrants a little bit more time than the roughly 15 minutes we have. We do get a reference to the Royal Flush Gang, since we're on the rooftop of a club of theirs, or something related to them. Don't know too much about them, other than that in certain iterations of them, they're just a group of people who fly around on a bunch of playing cards that can levitate in the air. They're pretty ridiculous in the world of the supervillains, so yeah. If you need a good laugh, go ahead and look them up. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of ridiculous villains for DC. I mean, they literally have one named Brainiac. But yeah, these guys are just... I don't even know what to say about them. They're just a really random bunch. It's kind of like someone looked up Gambit from Marvel, but they're just like, no, rather than throwing exploding playing cards, let's just have them surf on some playing cards. I don't know, it's just a really weird concept.
I nearly had you, Batman. Back on that cruise ship. You won't get away again.
If it helps, look at this like a retirement party.
I'm taking on a watchtower overlooking Grand Avenue intersection.
Be careful, sir.
On the bright side, we only have a few more of these rooftop settings to take down, so yay, we're almost done with Occupy Gotham. That just leaves the campaign for disarmament and armored and dangerous to go. That'd be the one with the bombs and the one with the armored vehicles. That being said, in the very next video, I believe we're going to go ahead and take on the armored vehicles, and then we're going to follow up everything with the bomb mission. And once we have both of those taken care of, then we get our long-awaited confrontation against Slade Wilson. And remember, I didn't feel like there was a whole lot of marketing or word of mouth that hyped up Deathstroke for this game, so I had a little bit of a bad feeling. And in about 2 episodes, we're going to get to know, was that feeling warranted, or was he a pleasant surprise? Also, now that I'm watching this back, I forgot how annoying that drone was. You don't see it, but whenever I was just trying to approach this little area to take out the radar, it also saw me a bunch of times and zapped me a bunch of times. I was really sick of that drone by the time this little milestone was completed.
3 watchtowers remaining. They'll be waiting.
You did me a favor, Bat, throwing me in Blackgate. You'd be surprised at the offers that came my way.
Are you okay, man? Yeah. Yeah, I'm okay. You sure?
The militia have men on the roof of the Kingston Bank. I'm going to take them out.
I might be getting my banks mixed up here just a little bit, but I'm thinking back to those two-faced bandit-related milestones, and I think the very last bank that we prevented him from robbing was this one right here. And if that's the case, this radar being here is very thematically appropriate, because if you'll recall, once Two-Face did go into the bank to come after us, he was no longer escorted by members of his own gang. He was being escorted by members of the militia. So, if this is the same bank, having them posted up here makes sense because they're already preparing to back up Harvey anyway. And like I said a couple of times now, I don't know for sure if it's the same bank, and even if it is, I don't know if they planned it out that way. But if they did, that's an awesome little attention to detail considering that they would have been on standby to back him up even further if the militia that they sent in there to help him also got taken out, along with the Two-Face gang. Having said that though, depending on the order that you do these missions, these guys are either really oblivious or just the worst teammates in the world. Because if you do the Two-Faced Bandit side mission first, these guys are still just hanging out here long after you got Harvey Dent arrested. I guess they were just like, you know what, screw that guy and his two faces, we are not getting paid enough to go in there and back up our people. We're just gonna chill up here and enjoy the rain on Halloween. Maybe they're even gonna have some French toast while they hang out up here, because I have not gotten a French toast reference in about this game in a pretty long time. May as well just throw it in here.
Sure, it's Firefly.
2 watchtowers still standing.
A pity to leave loose ends, sir.
You caught me off guard last time, I admit. I didn't think you could put up a fight.
There's a well-protected watchtower in the south of Miyagani Island. I need to plan my attack.
Alright, here's the plan. There are a bunch of radars scanning the top of this rooftop. If you step into their range, they're going to start shooting at you immediately. So what you want to do is try to get that big crowd's attention, and you want to lure them to the back of one of the buildings. Then you have the option to take them out single-handedly, and once you have gone hand-to-hand with every single one of them and beaten them, all that remains are just the automated guns. Then you can blind them, and once blinded, you can get over to the radar and blow it up, and then you're good to proceed to the final, God, that's good to say, to the final milestone of Occupy Gotham. During that final milestone, I'll go ahead and start the outro to save us a little bit of time, since we're cutting it very close to that hour mark, and I really try to avoid the videos being longer than an hour if I can help it. That being said, this is going to be, regardless of how close it is to the hour mark, the longest side mission that we have done so far. Hopefully it stays that way, because I don't want to make it a habit of having to do hour-long videos. Fortunately, the very next video that we're going to be doing, the Armored and Dangerous one, it's the shortest militia mission, so it's really likely it's only going to be about half of this, if that. So yeah, like a 25-minute video sounds amazing after doing all of this. Also, you may have noticed, but I did not follow my own advice. I did not lure all the people to the back of the building immediately and then take out the automated guns. I went in the complete opposite order. I went ahead and took out the automated guns, and then I went after the people. Actually, I didn't go after the people immediately after that either. I completely forgot to mention that there are some armed gunmen at the back of each building. So yeah, definitely gave you bad advice. Try this order instead. Go after the automated guns, then go after the armed men, and then lure everyone else around and beat the crap out of them like you always do. And then go ahead and get that radar and call it a day. Oh, and also there are some medical personnel that are along with this big group. You definitely don't need me to tell you this at this point, but make sure you prioritize them after you take care of the guns. If you let them, the medical people are just going to revive everybody and cause you to have to do way more work than you should. And when you already have to do like 60 of these little milestones, you don't need more work. So yeah, go ahead and take out the medical personnel and then take out everyone else while they shiver in horror as their medical care is completely and absolutely unconscious on the ground.
Is there anywhere left that ain't been looted? I'm getting bored.
One militia watchtower left, Alfred. Time to finish this.
And finish it you shall, Master Bruce. Please send them my regards.
The night might be gone, Batman, but I'm gonna finish this.
Watch out for the bat. I'm not getting caught like last time.
They've commandeered a rooftop in Kingston. These men are armed. They won't see me coming.
Ah, a stealth-based attack. A wise strategy, sir.
Alright, we are finally on the very last milestone of Occupy Gotham. So I'm going to go ahead and utilize this time to start the outro. Rather than waiting for the mission to be completed entirely, I think this is probably the best time to go ahead and do the outro just to save a few seconds to minutes. Like I said previously, I am very determined to keep this under 60 minutes. And yeah, sometimes I can get a little bit ranty and, talk a little bit extra, so this is pretty much the only way I can guarantee that happens. Looking back on this episode, what did it contribute to Deathstroke being in the story of Batman Arkham Knight? Your answer, not a lot, really.
Possible man down. Search the area. Find him.
In the previous episode, we already discovered that Deathstroke is the new commander of the militia. He's not going to go anywhere regardless of the Scarecrow and Arkham Knight no longer being in the picture. His number one goal is to finish the job, and by finish the job, he means kill the Batman. The radar's on top of a bunch of rooftops all around Gotham City. With all the radars gone, you're pretty much free to fly around with very minimal chance of someone shooting at you anymore. So we are free to fly around, assuming you took out the drones that are also flying around the city. That's it. There is no new storytelling related information, at least not from a Batman Arkham Knight perspective. As far as storytelling goes, I feel like there's been a bunch of it in this episode, just not about the video game. There's been a lot of talking about the comics though, so there's that. And we still got a little bit of time to kill, so why not? Let's go ahead and summarize what we talked about from the comics, even though it has nothing to do with this video game. From the comics, we talked about specifically the Legacy storyline and the Lobo Hunt storyline from New 52. In those, we see Deathstroke going from being scrutinized by the rest of the world for thinking that he's a little bit old and outdated as a mercenary, to reestablishing himself as the world's greatest assassin, only to eventually be defeated by his own son and then left kind of questioning what his role in the world is yet again. After that encounter, he feels like he needs to either prove himself further or go out in a blaze of glory, and he finds the perfect target to do that, that target being the intergalactic bounty hunter known as Lobo. He goes after Lobo, realizes he's completely outclassed, but somehow manages to think his way out of a very deadly situation and come out on top.
Divide and conquer, right, Batman? You know the art of war. Double up! Cover each other's backs now! Buddy up! Don't let him get you!
Lobo would eventually return to the comics, but nothing related to Deathstroke. And then Deathstroke went on to fight a bunch of ninjas, and we got to see his backstory where he met his wife. And yeah, that's about it, besides me making a little bit of commentary on the fly in the last few milestones because I honestly ran out of things to talk about. I think that's going to do it today.
I've been waiting. I always knew I'd get another shot at you.
In the next video, we're going to be handling the armored and dangerous side mission, so stay tuned for that. But this is all for Occupy Gotham. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you continue to enjoy the videos as they get released. Take care, and I will see you next time.
Batman, you're a hard man to kill. You remind me of this guerrilla fighter, kept raiding our camp in Troubadour. We got him eventually, nailed his head to a wall.
One chance, Slade. Leave Gotham. Now.
I don't think so. You've done good work on my towers, I admit, but we still control the roads. And I've got an army of drones ready to tear you apart on the ground.